Once upon a time, a young man lived deep in the mountains. He was poor and worked hard every day, gathering firewood and searching for food. That winter was especially harsh, with cold winds biting his cheeks and snow so deep that walking was difficult. One day, the young man went far into the mountains to collect firewood. The air was freezing, and the trees were covered in snow, making everything look white. All he could hear were his footsteps and his breath in the cold air. The winter scene felt very lonely. Suddenly, he heard a faint sound. The young man stopped and listened carefully. He noticed something moving behind the trees. Quietly, he followed the sound. There, he found a crane trapped in a snare. Its beautiful white feathers were stained with bright red blood. The crane struggled to escape, its eyes filled with fear and pain. Its cries were getting weaker. The young man's heart ached at the sight. Even though he was hungry and poor, he couldn't leave the crane to die. "Don't worry, I'll help you," he said softly. He quickly freed the crane from the snare and held it in his arms. Its body was cold and trembling. After a while, the crane regained its strength and stood up. The young man looked into its eyes and saw a light of gratitude. Almost as if there was something magical about the crane. The crane spread its wings wide, bowed as if to thank him, and flew up into the sky. The young man watched until it disappeared from view. Several days later, late one night, there was a knock at the young man's door. In the stillness of the cold winter night, the sound was sharp and clear. Surprised, he opened the door and found a beautiful woman standing there. She looked like a flower blooming in the snow, with long black hair and a white kimono that swayed in the wind. "I lost my way while traveling, and I cannot bear the cold anymore. Could you please let me stay for the night?" she asked. Her voice was soft, like snow falling on a quiet winter night. And it touched the young man's heart. Moved by her gentle request, he invited her inside. He prepared a meal for her and lit the fire. The flames flickered, casting shadows on the walls as they sat together. She spoke softly. "I have no home to return to. If you don't mind, could I stay here and live with you?" she asked. The young man was surprised but captivated by her kindness and quiet beauty. He decided to welcome her into his home as his wife. The two began a peaceful life together. One day, the woman said to the young man, "I am skilled at weaving. Let me make some cloth to help support our home. But I have one request while I am weaving, please do not look into the room." The young man promised to respect her wish. She locked herself in a room and began weaving. For many days, the sound of her loom could be heard from inside. But she never came out. The young man grew curious, but he kept his promise and did not peek inside. One day, she came out with the finished cloth. It was the most beautiful fabric he had ever seen, glowing with a soft light. The young man took the cloth to town, where it sold for a high price. With the money, their life became more comfortable. However, as time passed, the young man's curiosity grew stronger. How could she weave such beautiful cloth? Why did she lock the door every time? These questions filled his mind until one day, he couldn't resist any longer. Quietly, he opened the door and looked inside. Inside, he saw a crane weaving the cloth. The crane was pulling out its own feathers and weaving them into the fabric. Its body was thin and weak from sacrificing its feathers. The young man stood frozen in shock and regret. The crane looked up slowly and met his eyes. There was sadness in its gaze. "I am the crane you saved. I took human form to repay your kindness. But now that you have seen my true form, I cannot stay with you any longer," the crane said quietly. The crane spread its wings once more, looked at the young man for the last time, and flew up into the sky. The young man stood there, watching the crane until it disappeared. The cold wind blew again, and snow began to fall over the quiet village. The young man returned home, but the warmth the woman had brought was gone. He sat alone by the fire, which was slowly dying out. His eyes fell upon the cloth she had left behind. The cloth, woven from the crane's white feathers, glowed softly as if her spirit remained within it. The young man reached out and gently touched the fabric, feeling its softness. "She was truly here," he whispered, closing his eyes. He could still feel her warmth. And a quiet mix of gratitude and deep regret filled his heart. The crane would never return, but her memory would live on forever in the young man's heart. A silent reminder of their brief time together. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in quiet whiteness. The young man listened to the soft sound of the snow as he sat by the fire, closing his eyes and remembering the crane.